Hello, Glacier Gateway. We'd love to introduce you to our teachers and staff. The ladies who bring us our awesome breakfast and lunch are Amber, Carolyn, and Mandy. The custodians who keep our school nice and clean are Michael, Ruby, Tessa, and Lisa. Our kindergarten teachers are Mrs. Emerson, Miss Erler, Mrs. Oram, Mrs. Schaefer, and Mrs. Queen. And of course we can't forget Mrs. Douglas, Mrs. Davis, Miss Christensen, and Mrs. Jorgensen. In first grade, you know these ladies: Mrs. Kazaza, Mrs. Grilly, Mrs. Hess, and Mrs. Weaver. In second grade, Mrs. Getz, Mrs. Harries, Miss Coleman, and Mrs. Paget. In third grade, the third grade teachers are Mrs. Caudell, Mr. Berkey, Mrs. Cox, and Mr. Miller. Our fourth grade teachers. These teachers are Mrs. Brandstetter, Mrs. Dews, Mrs. Gnauk, and Mrs. Lightsky. Fifth grade teachers. We have Mr. Vanderweed, Mrs. Colleran, and Mrs. Jones. And helping teach in all the classrooms, we have Mrs. Love, Mrs. Vickery, and Mrs. Pittman. Teaching us music and physical education, we have Mrs. Hanson, Mr. Jones, and Mrs. Schaefer. In the library, we have Mrs. Lamb and Mrs. Osborne. In the computer lab, we have Mrs. Kendall. Teachers that offer our students help in all kinds of areas are: in third, fourth, and fifth grade, we have Mrs. McBroom, Mrs. Danley, and Mrs. Camrood. In third through fifth grade, we have Mrs. Polzine, Mrs. Sievertson, Mrs. Underdahl, and Mrs. Henning. Helping with speech, we have Mrs. Martin. For occupational therapy, we have Mrs. Haskins and Mrs. Hayter. Here's Mrs. Burns and Mrs. Hilton Lewis, who teach reading. Mrs. Bryan, who teaches math. Mrs. Miller, Mr. Thompson, and Mrs. Schwenk for counseling and life skills. Here's Mrs. Gordon and Mrs. Williams, who also provide counseling through CSCT. From our communications department, the ladies that help our students with autism, we have Mrs. Butler, Mrs. Apple, Mrs. Davis, Mrs. Fischel, Mrs. Lyman, Mrs. Ryan Nace, and Mrs. Sweeney. Our nurse is Nurse Casey. School resource officer, you may see him in the halls. He's here to keep us safe, is Mr. Haddenham. And lastly, but surely not least, in the office is Mrs. Phipps, and the head of our school, our principal, Mrs. Anello.